The water remembers. It remembers the shape of every lung it filled, the frantic beat of every heart it silenced, and the final, silent scream that bubbled from 1,000 throats, lost in the churning, muddy dark. Water has a memory longer than any human archive, deeper than any sealed vault, more faithful than any sworn oath. It carries within its molecules the echoes of every drowning, every desperate gasp, every prayer that was swallowed before it could reach the heavens. And on the 31st of May, in the year 1889, the waters of Lake Conemaugh began to whisper a prophecy of doom, a prophecy that would be fulfilled with a violence so absolute, so complete, that the very landscape of western Pennsylvania was forever scarred, not just in its geography, but in its soul. You have heard of the Johnstown Flood. You have seen the grainy photographs, the black and white images of twisted railroad tracks and shattered buildings, the endless rows of coffins, the faces of survivors frozen in expressions of hollow, uncomprehending grief. You have read the history books, the official accounts that speak of a tragic natural disaster, a catastrophe of biblical proportions that claimed over 2,000 lives. But what if I told you that everything you know about the Johnstown Flood is a carefully constructed lie? What if I told you that the true horror was not the wall of water that descended upon the valley with the force of a vengeful God, but what happened in the days and weeks that followed? What if I told you that the investigators who arrived to document the tragedy, to offer comfort and find answers, were instead tasked with a far darker mission, to bury a secret so terrifying, so profane, so utterly damning to the human soul, that the full truth was forbidden to ever see the light of day? This is the story they tried to erase from history. This is the macabre secret of the Johnstown Flood, and a revelation that has been kept from you for nearly a century and a half, hidden in the shadowy archives of power, whispered about only in the darkest corners of historical research, and denied by every official institution that had the power to silence it. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the valley as it was before the disaster. Picture a narrow, winding gorge carved by the Conemaugh River over millennia, a steep-sided trough of green hills and industrial grit. The town of Johnstown itself was a testament to the American dream, or at least, the American ambition. It was a place of hard work and harder living, a crucible of smoke and steel where immigrants from Wales, Germany, Ireland, and Eastern Europe had come to forge a new life. The Cambria Iron Works dominated the skyline, its massive furnaces belching black smoke into the perpetually gray sky, its rolling mills clanging with the deafening rhythm of industry. The air was thick with the smell of coal dust, sulfur, and sweat. The streets were unpaved in many places, turning to rivers of mud whenever it rained, which was often. The houses clung to the hillsides like desperate climbers, their wooden frames precarious, their foundations shallow. It was a town that existed on the edge, balanced between prosperity and poverty, between survival and disaster. And high above them, 18 miles upstream, hidden in the Allegheny Mountains, was the source of their prosperity and, as they would soon discover, their doom. The South Fork Dam was a colossus of human engineering, an earthen wall that stretched 931 feet across the valley, holding back the vast, 17-million-gallon Lake Conemaugh. The lake itself was a playground for the rich and powerful, a private fishing retreat owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, an exclusive association of Pittsburgh's industrial elite. The membership reads like a who's who of American capitalism: Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate who would become one of the richest men in history. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's ruthless partner, a man whose name would become synonymous with labor oppression. Andrew Mellon, the banking tycoon whose family would dominate American finance for generations. These were men who owned railroads, steel mills, coal mines, and the very politicians who were supposed to keep them in check. They had purchased the abandoned reservoir and the dilapidated dam for a song, as a weekend getaway, a place to escape the grime and noise of the cities. They built a grand clubhouse, a 3-story Victorian structure with wraparound porches and a ballroom. They stocked the lake with bass and pike, imported from as far away as the Great Lakes. They threw extravagant parties on its shores, feasting on roasted game and fine wine while the workers below toiled in their mills. They were gods of industry, playing at being lords of the manor, blissfully unaware that the very foundation of their paradise was crumbling beneath their feet. But they were careless gods, indifferent gods, gods who believed that their wealth and power could insulate them from the natural laws that governed the rest of humanity. You see, the South Fork Dam was not originally built by these industrial titans. It had been constructed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the 1850s as part of a canal system that was already obsolete by the time it was completed. The original design was a marvel of 19th-century engineering. It was a massive earthen structure, meticulously constructed with a solid clay core, a stone culvert for drainage, and a spillway designed to handle overflow. It had been built to last, to withstand the ravages of time and weather. But the new owners, in their hubris, had made a series of catastrophic changes. To allow for a road to cross the top of the dam, they lowered its crest by several feet. To improve access for their fishing boats and to prevent the expensive game fish from escaping, they removed the iron grating from the spillway and replaced it with a series of coarse mesh screens. These screens were a terrible design flaw. They were constantly clogging with debris, fallen branches, dead leaves, the detritus of the forest that washed down from the surrounding hills. They required constant maintenance, constant attention, and the club's managers, who were more interested in serving cocktails than inspecting infrastructure, often neglected them. The dam was a ticking clock, and the men in charge were too busy counting their money to hear it tick. They knew the dam was compromised. In 1881, 3 years before the disaster, a local engineer named John Fulton had inspected the structure and warned the club president, Elias Unger, of the danger. He wrote a detailed report, pointing out the design flaws, the unsafe screens, the inadequate spillway capacity. He warned that a heavy rain could cause the dam to fail, with catastrophic consequences for the valley below. His report was ignored. It was filed away, forgotten, buried beneath the weight of complacency and arrogance. The club members dismissed him as an alarmist, a crank, a man who didn't understand the scale of their operation. They were men of industry, men who had built empires. They did not take advice from hired engineers. They were the ones who gave orders, not received them. And so, the warnings went unheeded, the danger was ignored, and the seeds of disaster were sown in the soil of hubris. The rain began on the morning of the 30th of May, a slow, relentless, drenching downpour that seemed to leach all color from the world. It wasn't a dramatic, crashing thunderstorm with lightning bolts and rolling thunder. It was something far more insidious, a suffocating, oppressive deluge that wrapped the valley in a gray, weeping shroud. The clouds hung so low you felt you could reach up and touch them, a damp, heavy blanket that pressed down on the land like a funeral pall. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, mottled and sickly. The birds had stopped singing 2 days prior, as if they sensed something terrible on the horizon. The livestock were restless, lowing and stamping in their pens, their eyes wide with a primal fear that their human masters could not understand. The creeks and streams that fed Lake Conemaugh began to swell rapidly, their waters rising with alarming speed. By the morning of the 31st, the situation had become critical. Elias Unger, the club president, stood on the dam's crest and looked out over the churning waters of the lake. He was a practical man, a businessman, not an engineer, but even he could see the danger. The water level had risen more than 8 feet in 24 hours. The lake was a seething cauldron of brown, muddy water, churning and frothing as if it were alive. The waves lapped at the top of the earthen wall, hungry and insistent, like the tongue of a giant beast tasting its prey. Unger and his men worked frantically, trying to clear the clogged spillway, their axes and saws futile against the torrent of debris that surged against the mesh screens. They hacked at the branches and logs that were piled against the screens, but more debris was constantly washing down from the hills, replacing what they removed. They were trying to bail out the Atlantic with a thimble. A photographer, a man named J.A. Walker, arrived at the dam that morning. He was a local professional, hired to document the club's activities and the beauty of the lake. He set up his large-format camera on the crest of the dam and took a photograph that would become one of the most haunting images of the 19th century. It is the last picture ever taken of the South Fork Dam before its destruction. In the photograph, the water is a murky, churning gray, and it is just inches from the top of the earthen wall. A lone worker stands on the crest, a tiny, insignificant figure, his face turned away from the camera, looking down at the monstrous force he is trying to contain. He is dwarfed by the scale of the lake, by the immensity of the water. In the background, the sky is a flat, featureless white, as if the world has been erased. The photograph is a prophecy of doom captured in silver and light. The water is whispering to the worker, promising destruction. And the worker, in his heart, knows that his efforts are futile. The whispers went unheeded. There were no sirens in Johnstown. No official warning. Some say a telegram was sent from the dam to the town, warning of the imminent danger, but it arrived too late, or was ignored, swallowed up by the chaos of a failing railroad system. Others say the warning was deliberately suppressed, that the club members were so concerned about the scandal of their negligence that they chose to remain silent. The truth is lost to history, buried beneath the weight of convenience and guilt. All that was heard in the town below was the sound of a distant, growing roar, a sound so deep and powerful it was felt in the bones before it was heard by the ears. It was a sound like a great, muffled thunderclap, but continuous, unending, growing louder with each passing second. People paused in the streets, looked up at the sky, and wondered what it could be. They had no idea that the sound was the voice of their own extinction. One man who was at the dam that afternoon, a club employee named John Park, saw it happen with his own eyes. He was standing on the downstream face of the dam when he noticed a small trickle of water at the base of the structure, near the center. It was a tiny thing, a thin rivulet of muddy water that emerged from a crack in the earthen wall. He stared at it for a moment, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. A trickle was nothing. Dams always had small leaks. But this trickle was growing, widening, becoming a stream. He saw the crack expand, a dark line spreading upward across the face of the dam like a wound opening. The earth groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. The water was finding its way into the heart of the dam, eroding the clay core, weakening the structure from the inside out. The trickle became a torrent became a flood, and the flood became a cataclysm. The dam simply surrendered. It didn't break in a single, catastrophic explosion. It was torn apart from the inside out, eaten away by the water it was supposed to contain. The earthen wall disintegrated in a matter of seconds, turning from a solid barrier into a liquid wave of destruction. Park later described the sound as a sickening groan of tearing earth, followed by a roar so loud it seemed to shake the very sky. The water erupted through the breach with the force of a volcanic explosion, a wall of black, churning death that shot down the valley at a speed of 40 miles per hour. 1 billion gallons of water, 17 million tons of liquid destruction, was unleashed in a single, apocalyptic instant. It was a moving mountain of water, mud, trees, and debris, a wall 40 feet high in some places, that swept away everything in its path. Houses, factories, churches, trains, bridges, all were picked up and tossed around like children's toys, ground into splinters against the valley walls. The water didn't just flow, it ground, it crushed, it annihilated. It had a hunger, a desperate, ravenous appetite for destruction that was almost sentient in its intensity. It devoured the valley, leaving behind only a landscape of mud and ruins. But what happened next, the part that has been whispered about in the dark corners of history, the part that the official accounts never mention, is where the true horror begins. The initial impact was a cataclysm, a moment of sheer, awe-inspiring terror that numbed the mind. If you were in Johnstown that day, you wouldn't have had time to think. You wouldn't have had time to pray or cry out or say goodbye to the people you loved. You would have simply been erased. A witness, a man named James Horner who was perched on a hillside above the town, said the roar of the wave was replaced by a sudden, horrifying silence, and then a sound like a million souls all screaming at once for a single, agonizing second, before they were submerged. It was a sound he could never forget. He said, for the rest of his long life, he would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and trembling, the echo of that single, unified scream ringing in his ears. It was the sound of a town dying. The wave hit Johnstown at 4:07 p.m. on May 31, 1889. In less than 10 minutes, the town was gone. Over 2,200 people were dead. Entire families were wiped from existence, their homes, their lineage, their stories all swallowed by the mud. The bodies were everywhere, tangled in the wreckage, half submerged in the putrid water, their faces frozen in expressions of primal, uncomprehending terror. The water, you see, had a peculiar effect. It stripped the clothing from the dead, leaving them naked and exposed, a horrifying testament to their final, desperate struggle. Many had their limbs broken, their skulls crushed by the debris. Some were missing entirely, torn apart by the violence of the torrent. It was a tableau of pure, unadulterated horror, a prophecy of hell made manifest on earth. The stench was unbearable, a thick, cloying, sickly sweet odor of wet earth, decay, and death. It clung to your clothes, your skin, your very soul. The survivors, the lucky ones, were left catatonic, wandering through the wreckage, calling out the names of loved ones who would never answer. They stumbled through the mud like ghosts, their eyes blank, their mouths open in silent screams. The town was unrecognizable. The streets that had once been lined with houses and shops were now a labyrinth of debris, a twisted jumble of wood, metal, and human remains. The Cambria Iron Works, the beating heart of the town's economy, was reduced to a skeletal wreck of rusted beams and broken machinery. The great stone bridge at the entrance to the town, which had been built to carry the Pennsylvania Railroad across the Conemaugh River, was still standing, but it was choked with debris. The water had piled up against its arches, creating a massive, grisly dam of wreckage that stretched for blocks. Bodies were woven into the debris like threads in a tapestry, their limbs intertwined with beams and boards. The rescuers, who arrived from the surrounding towns and cities in the hours after the disaster, were overwhelmed by the scale of the horror. They had never seen anything like it, had never imagined that such destruction was possible. They worked with frantic desperation, pulling survivors from the wreckage, digging through the mud for the dead, trying to make sense of the chaos. But there was no sense to be made. There was only the screaming of the wounded, the moaning of the dying, and the endless, suffocating silence of the dead. And it was then, in the days immediately following the disaster, that the investigators came. Not just doctors and rescue workers, but officials from the newly formed American Red Cross, led by the indomitable Clara Barton herself. She was a woman of iron will and boundless compassion, a battlefield nurse who had seen the horrors of the Civil War, who had tended to the wounded and dying in the filth of army hospitals. She had thought she had seen the worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. But when she arrived in Johnstown, she was shaken to her core. She walked through the streets of the ruined town, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She wrote in her diary that the scene was beyond description, that no words could capture the horror of what she had witnessed. She said that she would carry the images of Johnstown in her mind for the rest of her life, and that they would haunt her dreams until her dying day. The investigators came from the Pennsylvania Railroad, 2 men of steel and steam who had been dispatched to restore the train lines and recover the bodies. They were pragmatic, no-nonsense types, men who had seen their share of workplace accidents and industrial disasters. They were not easily shocked. But even they were repulsed by what they found. They spoke of the bodies in hushed tones, of the terrible contortions of the limbs, the frozen expressions of terror on the faces, the way the water had stripped the flesh from the bones. They spoke of finding families clustered together in their final moments, their arms wrapped around each other as if they could shield themselves from the unimaginable force of the wave. They spoke of children, so many children, their small bodies broken and bruised, their faces peaceful in death as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But it was what they found in the murky depths of that putrid lake, the stagnant backwaters of the flood, that would change everything. The official reports, the ones that were published in the newspapers of the time, spoke of the heroic efforts to pull bodies from the wreckage. They spoke of the relief camps, the donations, the stories of survival. They painted a picture of a community united in grief, of a nation rallying to support its suffering citizens. They spoke of the noble dead, the souls who had perished in a tragic act of God. But a smaller, more terrifying narrative was circulating, one that was never printed, never spoken of in public. It was a whispered story, shared in hushed tones between doctors, politicians, and the men of the railroad, a story of a discovery so dark, so profoundly disturbing, that it was deemed too dangerous for the public to know. They found the bodies, yes. But they also found things. The bodies weren't all the same. Some of the dead were not simply victims of the flood, they were victims of something else. Something that had happened in those frantic, terrifying hours after the water hit. Something that the survivors were desperate to forget, and that the authorities were desperate to conceal. Some of the bodies showed signs of a struggle that had nothing to do with the torrent. Strange marks, deep lacerations that couldn't have been caused by debris. Teeth marks. Not human teeth marks, but something else, something that had been driven by a primal, animalistic hunger. The rescue workers, hardened men who had seen their share of gore in the mills and the mines, were shaken to their core. They told of finding clusters of bodies in the basements of ruined buildings, hidden in corners, their faces contorted not just in fear of drowning, but in pure, existential terror. Some were missing limbs, perfectly and cleanly removed, as if by surgical precision. Others had their throats torn out, their flesh gouged and shredded. What had happened in the darkness? What had the survivors done to each other in those desperate hours when the water was rising and the world was ending? The investigators, the doctors, the officials who arrived in the aftermath, they found the evidence. They found the mutilated bodies. And they knew they had stumbled upon something far more horrifying than a flood. They had stumbled upon the truth of what happens when civilization collapses, when the thin veneer of social order is stripped away, and the primal beast that lurks within every human heart is unleashed. Imagine it, if you will. You are a survivor. The initial wave has passed, but you are trapped in the pitch-black, flooded basement of a collapsed building. The water is ice-cold, rising slowly, lapping at your chin. The air is thick with the smell of coal oil and mud, a suffocating, cloying stench that fills your lungs and makes you gag. You can hear others trapped around you, crying, moaning, praying. Their voices echo in the darkness, a chorus of despair that seems to come from all directions at once. And then, the moans stop. One by one, the voices are silenced. The prayers turn to screams, and the screams are cut short, as if by a knife. In the darkness, you feel something brush against your leg. Not debris. Something cold, and firm. It's a hand. Not reaching for help, but grasping, pulling, dragging you down into the black water. In the fight for survival, neighbors turned on neighbors. Friends became food. The lines between man and beast, between civilization and savagery, were drawn in the muddy water, and they were red. The railroad men were the first to act. Their priority was to get the trains running again, to restore the lifeline to the outside world, to bring in supplies and evacuate the survivors. They were a pragmatic, no-nonsense lot, men of steel and steam, men who believed in order and efficiency. But even they were repulsed by what they found. They began to quietly bury the bodies in mass graves, a desperate attempt to contain the horror. They didn't want reporters seeing what they had found. They didn't want the public to know that the survivors of this tragedy had been reduced to savages. It was a decision born of fear and expediency, a decision that would shape the narrative of the flood for generations to come. The mass graves were dug on the hillsides overlooking the ruined town, long trenches that were filled with row after row of bodies. The dead were stacked like cordwood, their limbs tangled together, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The burial parties worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, driven by a desperate need to finish the task before the smell became unbearable. The ground was soft and wet from the rain, making the digging easy, but the bodies were heavy and slippery, covered in mud and slime. The workers wore handkerchiefs over their faces to block the stench, but it didn't help. The smell seeped through, a sickly sweet odor that clung to their clothes and hair, that seemed to follow them home and haunt their dreams. Many of the workers were volunteers from the surrounding towns, men who had come to help and had stayed to bury the dead. They spoke little during the work, their faces grim, their eyes hollow. They had seen things that could not be unseen, had touched things that could not be touched. And then, there was the question of the survivors. The ones who had been pulled from the wreckage, who had survived the initial flood and its aftermath. They were traumatized, of course, their minds shattered by the horror they had witnessed. But some of them were different. They showed signs of a trauma that went beyond the ordinary, a trauma that had a physical manifestation. Some of the survivors, the ones who had been trapped in the dark basements, who had been forced to fight for their survival, they were changed. Their eyes had a wild, feral look, like the eyes of cornered animals. They flinched at sudden sounds, recoiled from touch, spoke in whispers or not at all. They had seen the abyss, and the abyss had seen them. The line between human and monster had been crossed, and there was no going back. The investigators, the doctors who had come to tend to the survivors, began to notice something else, something that made their blood run cold. The survivors who had been trapped together, who had been forced to fight for their lives in the darkness, they were not just traumatized. They were marked. Some had strange marks on their bodies, marks that looked like bite marks but were too large, too irregular to be human. Others had strange growths on their skin, patches of discolored flesh that seemed to have a life of their own. Some were suffering from a strange form of madness, a psychosis that manifested as a pathological fear of water. They couldn't bear to be near it, couldn't bear to hear it, couldn't bear to touch it. The sound of running water would send them into screaming fits, their eyes rolling back in their heads, their bodies convulsing as if they were being tortured. The doctors called it hydrophobia, a rare and terrifying condition. They treated the survivors with sedatives and confinement, but nothing worked. The madness was too deep, too ingrained. It had become a part of them. The official investigation, the one that was forbidden to publish, began in the weeks after the flood. It was conducted by a committee of engineers, politicians, and lawyers, all appointed by the state of Pennsylvania. They were tasked with determining the cause of the disaster and assigning blame. But the investigation was a sham from the beginning. The investigators were almost all members of the same exclusive clubs, the same political circles as the owners of the South Fork Dam. They had been sent, not to find the truth, but to protect the reputations of the powerful. They had to control the narrative. A flood was a tragedy, an act of God that could be blamed on the weather. But a story of survivors turning into ravenous, subhuman monsters? That was a scandal that would tear the country apart, revealing the dark, primal truth that lies just beneath the thin veneer of our civilization. The testimony was manipulated. Witnesses who had seen the true horror were either bribed to stay silent, or their accounts were so traumatic they were deemed unreliable. The most damning evidence, the photographs, were confiscated. A local photographer, a man named Thomas L. Smith, had documented the grisly aftermath in exhaustive detail. He had photographed the bodies, the mass graves, the ruined buildings. He had photographed the mutilated corpses, the evidence of the desperate struggle. He was a respected professional, a man of integrity who believed in the power of photography to capture the truth. But his truth was too dangerous. A week after the event, Smith was found dead in his studio, a single gunshot wound to the head. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. He had taken his own life out of grief, the authorities said, overcome by the suffering he'd witnessed. But the rumors were that he had been silenced, that his photographs had been confiscated and destroyed, that the men in power had decided that his vision of the truth was too dangerous to be allowed to exist. He was a loose end, and he was cleanly snipped. The official cause of death for the flood was blamed on the dam's poor design, which was certainly true, but it was a convenient half-truth. The more grotesque details were buried in a report that was sealed, not for the public, but for a select few. It was a report that painted a picture of a town engulfed in a literal hell. It spoke of unspeakable acts perpetrated in the darkness, of depravities that stagger the imagination, of a contagion of madness that threatened to spread. It recommended that certain information be kept from the public record, lest it incite panic and undermine the moral fabric of society. The hypocrisy is staggering. The men who had caused the disaster, who had allowed the dam to fall into disrepair, who had ignored the warnings of their own engineers, these same men were now dictating the terms of the investigation and deciding what the public was allowed to know. They were protecting their own reputations, their own power, their own privilege. The truth, the real truth, was a casualty of their ambition. But there was another secret, an even deeper secret, that the investigators uncovered in the course of their inquiry. A secret that went beyond the cannibalism and the madness, a secret that reached into the very heart of the horror. The water was the real monster. It was a vector, a delivery system for something that had been festering in the murky depths of the man-made lake for years. The owners of the club, the industrial titans, they had not just built a dam, they had created a reservoir, a massive, stagnant body of water that had become a breeding ground for something dark and ancient. Beneath its placid surface, a unique ecosystem had thrived, undisturbed by the currents and flows of a natural river. Bacteria, parasites, fungi, all had evolved in the stagnant depths of the lake, adapting to its unique conditions. They had been harmless, or at least dormant, while the lake was contained. But when the dam broke, when the water was released into the valley, it carried with it this hidden contagion, this invisible poison that would have consequences far more terrible than mere drowning. The survivors, the ones who were pulled from the water, who drank the water, who were cut and bruised by the debris, they became hosts. In the weeks that followed the flood, a wave of strange, unexplained illnesses swept through the relief camps. Men and women who had been fine one day would fall into a feverish delirium the next. They would speak in tongues, reliving the horror, clawing at their own skin as if trying to escape a prison of flesh. They would wake up in the night, screaming, their eyes wide and unseeing, their hands outstretched as if to ward off some invisible adversary. Some died from the sickness, their bodies succumbing to the poison in the water. But others, they were changed. Forever. The water hadn't just killed them, it had marked them. It had planted a seed, a dormant, living memory of the horror, within them. A memory that would be passed down, generation to generation, a ghost that would haunt the bloodline. The official investigation, the one whose results were forbidden to publish, documented these illnesses in agonizing detail. They spoke of a peculiar strain of hydrophobia, and a melancholia that borders on madness. They tried to medicate the survivors, but nothing worked. The sickness, they discovered, was not of the body, but of the soul. The flood had broken down a barrier, not just the earthen dam, but a psychological barrier. It had shown the town a glimpse of the abyss. It had made them realize that the world was not a safe, orderly place, but a chaotic, primal realm where anything was possible. And once you have seen the abyss, you can never unsee it. It follows you, whispers to you in the quiet moments, reminding you of your own fragile mortality. The investigators realized that the real threat wasn't just the physical disaster, but the contagion of terror that had been unleashed on the town. The flood was not the cause, it was merely the catalyst. They called it the Night of the Long Knives, a secret term used in the sealed report. Not an event, but a state of being. A complete and utter descent into madness. The story of Johnstown is not a ghost story. It's not a story of monsters or demons, not a story of haunted houses or vengeful spirits. It's a story of something far more terrifying. It's a story about us. About the thin line that separates us from the animals. About the terrifying ease with which civilization can be undone by a single, cataclysmic event. The true horror of Johnstown is that it could happen again. Not a flood, but a collapse of the social, moral, and psychological dams we have built around ourselves. The closed loop of the video of the rescue efforts, the film that was never shown, it's a loop of pure, unadulterated panic. It shows the faces of the rescuers, not as saviors, but as men realizing they are in over their heads. They were not rescuing a town from a flood, they were rescuing a town from itself. The secret they kept from us was not the details of the deaths, but the knowledge that the dead had ceased to be human in their final moments. They had become something else. Something that, in our hearts, we all know we are capable of becoming, if pushed far enough. It's the secret of who we are, buried beneath the dirty water of a failed dam in Pennsylvania. A secret the rich and powerful were so desperate to keep from the world, they were willing to bury the truth alongside the dead. The town was eventually rebuilt, physically. A new, stronger dam was constructed, a modern marvel of engineering that would never fail. The wounds of the disaster were salved by time and donations, by the relentless forward march of progress. The Cambria Iron Works was rebuilt, bigger and better than before. The streets were paved, the houses were reconstructed, the economy recovered. But the psychological scars, the ones left by the night of the long knives, never truly healed. There are families in Johnstown today who still carry the mark. Old-timers, the last surviving descendants of the survivors, whisper about it. They speak of a bad blood, a restlessness, a melancholia that runs in their veins. They say that on certain nights, when the wind blows down from the hills and the Conemaugh River is swollen with rain, you can still hear them. Not the screams of the dying, but the whispers of the damned. 1,000 voices, all muttering at once, a low, droning hum of despair that comes not from the river, but from the very ground itself. The land remembers. It remembers the blood, the tears, and the unspeakable acts. And it will never forget. The report was locked away, hidden in the archives of a historical society, in a box marked, "Private, do not publish." It was rediscovered in the 1970s by a historian named David McCullough, who was researching his masterful book on the flood. He was a meticulous researcher, a man dedicated to the truth, a man who had spent years of his life uncovering the secrets of the past. He found the sealed report, this forbidden history, and he read it. What he found in its pages, the sheer, unadulterated horror of the accounts, the descriptions of the mutilated bodies, the reports of the madness, the details of the cannibalism, it was so shocking, so profoundly disturbing, that he ultimately chose to exclude much of it from his final book. A man dedicated to the truth, choosing to remain silent. Why? Was he protecting the families? Was he worried about the impact of such a revelation on the descendants of the survivors? Or was he, too, afraid of the power of the secret? He used the basic facts, the story of the dam, the negligence, the suffering. But the macabre details, the cannibalism, the madness, the final, desperate depravity of the survivors, he left them out. He buried them, just as the railroad men had buried the bodies. He became another guardian of the secret. The video loop, the one of the rescuers, it's a haunting piece of film, a mirror that shows us our own reflection, a reflection of the monster we could become. And that is the story they were forbidden to publish. The truth of what we really are. And that is the legacy of the Johnstown Flood. Not a story of a natural disaster, but a story of a fundamental human failure. A failure of those in power to act responsibly, and a failure of our own collective psyche. The men who owned the dam were not just negligent, they were the architects of this horror. They created the lake, they neglected the dam, and they unleashed the primal terror upon the valley. They are the true villains of this story, not just for the deaths they caused, but for the silence they enforced. They were not just covering up their own culpability, they were covering up a truth about humanity. They were hiding the fact that we are all, at our core, just a heartbeat away from becoming animals. The dam was a symbol of our hubris, our belief that we could master nature. But the true catastrophe was the collapse of the dam of civilization, exposing the madness that lurks within. There is a story that has been passed down through the generations in Johnstown, a story that is told in hushed whispers around campfires and in the dark corners of bars. It is a story about a man named William H. Johnson, a survivor of the flood who was pulled from the wreckage 3 days after the disaster. He was found in the basement of a collapsed building, huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with terror. He was alive, but barely. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, and he was suffering from a high fever. The rescuers pulled him out and took him to the relief camp, where he was treated by a doctor. He was conscious, but he couldn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling, his mouth open, his eyes vacant. The doctor who treated him, a man named Dr. Edward Richardson, was a skilled physician who had seen his share of trauma. He had worked in the field hospitals during the Civil War, had tended to soldiers with limbs blown off by cannonballs, had watched men die in agony. But he had never seen anything like William H. Johnson. The man was catatonic, his body stiff, his eyes glassy. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't speak. He just lay there, staring at nothing. Dr. Richardson tried everything. He administered sedatives, stimulants, all the treatments he knew. Nothing worked. Johnson remained in his catatonic state, a living ghost. On the 4th day, Johnson finally spoke. He sat up suddenly in his bed, his eyes wide and wild, and he began to scream. It was not a human scream, but something else, something primal and animalistic. It was a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, a sound that was ancient and terrible. The other patients in the relief camp, the ones who had been silent and withdrawn, suddenly began to scream as well. It was a chorus of terror, a symphony of despair that echoed through the tents and barracks. Dr. Richardson ran to Johnson's bedside, trying to calm him, but the man was beyond reach. He was staring at something that no one else could see, something that seemed to be standing in the corner of the room. His eyes were fixed on the empty space, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Get away," Johnson whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Get away from me. You're not real. You're not real." Dr. Richardson looked at the corner of the room. There was nothing there. Just the canvas walls of the tent, the folding cot, the medical supplies. But Johnson was seeing something, something that filled him with absolute terror. His body was shaking, his hands trembling. He was sweating profusely, his skin pale and clammy. "I see them," Johnson said, his voice rising to a shriek. "They're all around me. They're reaching for me. They want me to join them. They want me to go down with them." "Who?" Dr. Richardson asked, his voice steady. "Who do you see?" Johnson turned to look at the doctor, and for a moment, his eyes were clear. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the abyss. "The drowned," he said. "All of them. The thousands. They're all here. They never left. They'll never leave. They're part of the water now. And the water remembers." Johnson collapsed back onto the bed, his body racked with convulsions. He died a few hours later, his heart giving out from the stress of whatever terror had claimed him. Dr. Richardson wrote in his notes that Johnson had suffered from a severe case of hydrophobia with attendant hallucinations. He didn't mention what Johnson had said about the drowned, about the water remembering. He didn't want to believe it. But he never forgot it. For the rest of his life, he would wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of Johnson screaming, by the terror in his eyes. He had seen the face of a man who had been touched by something beyond human understanding, something that had left a mark on his soul. The survivors of the Johnstown Flood were never the same. They carried the scars of the disaster with them for the rest of their lives, visible and invisible. Some turned to religion, seeking comfort in the arms of a loving God. Others turned to alcohol, trying to drown the memories in a haze of intoxication. Many never spoke of the flood again, refusing to acknowledge what had happened, refusing to confront the darkness that lurked within their own hearts. They went on with their lives, working, marrying, raising children, pretending that the horror was in the past. But it was never in the past. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. There are families in Johnstown today who still carry the mark of the flood, families who have passed down the trauma from generation to generation. They tell stories of strange dreams, of waking up in the middle of the night screaming, of feeling the cold touch of water on their skin. They speak of a restlessness, a feeling of being watched, a sense that something is waiting for them just beyond the edge of vision. Some have sought treatment, therapy, medication, trying to break the cycle of trauma. But it's never enough. The water remembers. And the water will never forget. The secret they kept from us was not just the details of the deaths, not just the horror of the cannibalism, not just the madness that claimed the survivors. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was the knowledge that we are not who we think we are. We believe ourselves to be civilized, rational, moral beings, capable of compassion and empathy. But the Johnstown flood showed us what we really are. It showed us that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, there lurks a beast, a primal creature driven by hunger and fear, a creature that will do anything to survive. It showed us that the line between human and monster is not a line at all, but a blur, a fading memory of a distinction that was never really there. The flood exposed the lie of our own humanity, and that is a truth too terrible to bear. The water remembers. It remembers the screaming, the praying, the silence. It remembers the bodies, the blood, the bones. It remembers the desperate struggle for survival, the moment when neighbor turned on neighbor, when friend became food. It remembers the madness that followed, the contagion of terror that spread through the survivors like a plague. It remembers the investigators, the ones who came to help and stayed to bury the truth. It remembers the secrets, the lies, the cover-ups. It remembers everything. And it will never forget. The water is patient. It can wait. It has waited for 136 years, and it can wait 100 more. It carries within it the echoes of the dead, the whispers of the damned, the memory of the unspeakable. And one day, it will rise again. So, the next time you hear the distant rumble of thunder, or the roar of a swollen river, remember Johnstown. Remember the silence that fell before the scream. Remember the weight of the water, the coldness of the mud, and the horror of the secrets that lie beneath. Remember that the greatest terrors are not the ones that come from without, but the ones that are born from within. The ones we carry in our blood, in our bones, and in our darkest, most hidden thoughts. The ones we pray we will never be forced to act upon. The Johnstown flood was a tragedy, yes. But it was also a prophecy. A prophecy of what happens when the world ends, and the thin veneer of society is stripped away, leaving only the raw, naked, screaming soul of humanity, exposed and helpless in the face of its own inner demons. Now, you know. You know the secret they tried to bury. You know the truth that was forbidden to publish. And you know that the water will always remember. What do you think happened next? What became of the survivors, and the investigators who sealed the secret? What happened to the descendants of the men who owned the dam, the men who caused the disaster and then covered it up? Comment below. But be careful what you wish for, because some secrets, once unearthed, can never be buried again. The whispers of the dead have found a new home, not in the archives, but in the hearts of those who listen. And they have a story to tell. A story that is just beginning. The water remembers. It remembers the shape of every lung it filled, the frantic beat of every heart it silenced, and the final, silent scream that bubbled from 1,000 throats, lost in the churning, muddy dark. It remembers you. It has always remembered you. And it is waiting.